So what is up people, welcome to the new video, and in this video we will be talking about promises in JavaScript. We will see how you can use promises instead of having multiple callbacks in a function, and we will also see how you can use async functions with await instead of using promise chains. So let's get started. So here, first of all, let's see, we have an array. Let's say we have an example array. Let's say the array name is superheroes. And in this array, we have some strings, right? Let's say some superhero names. Let's say Iron Man or Thor, or let's say Hulk, right? Now I have this array. Now let's say I have some API functions that I want to call in my code, so that so let's say one API function is get movies. So that function basically takes this array of superheroes and returns us a list of movies, right? So this is, let's implement a sample function. So we don't have any API here, but I'm implementing, let's say these are some API functions, right? You can assume that. So let's implement get movies function, and here let's say this get movies function will take an array of superheroes and it will return us some movies related to that superhero, right? But now I'm not implementing any logic. I'm not using any IMDb API here for getting the movies data. But for now, what I'm doing is, just for an example, I am adding movie after this Iron Man, like after this every superhero here in this array. So what I'm saying is const movies is equal to superheroes dot map, and I will change every element inside this array, and I will add movie after every string here. So how I can do that? I will just do superhero and return every superhero. After that add movie, right? Now I will return movies, right? So these are some API functions. Now let's say this is our code here. Later, let's say I want to call this API function and I will pass this superheroes array to this, right? And this array, this function basically returns movies like a list. So what I can do is I will just do console log get movies, and here I will pass this superheroes array, right? So here you can see we are getting a response. We are getting an array from this function, like it is saying Iron Man movie, Thor movie, and Hulk movie, right? Now this is completely fine. Now let's say once you get these movies data from this API function, now you want to do some other work, some other logic using this array of movies, right? So let's say you want to get some other data related to these movies. So let's say we have another API function. Let's say get movies data, and this get movies data basically takes an array of movies, and this will give us some other data related to that movie, right? So you can implement your logic if you want, but this is just an example code. I want to show you only how you can use callbacks and promises. So I'm just taking an example code here, right? So I will return here movies dot map movie, and I will return like IMDb movie, right? So here let's say once we are getting the movies array, I'm getting the movies here. Now after getting the movies array, I want to get movies data. So I will say movies data is equal to get movies data, and here I will pass the movies, right? So here what I did, I called this function get movies first, and I got the movies array, and then I called this function get movies data, and I passed this movies array to this function. So now I'm getting movies data. Now let me console log it. Yes, so here you can see now we are getting an array of movies data. So what I have done here, IMDb after the movie name, right? Now this is completely fine. This code is completely fine, but here the main scenario is it is not like that our code, these functions are here inside our code, but let's say these functions are not inside our code, these functions are some API functions, right? So we want to call some API, so that will take some time, obviously, right? So let's say this get movies function will take some time, like let's say 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, whatever it will take. So it will take some time to return the data of movies, right? So when this will take some time, let's say this, when we call this function and it take, let's say 2 seconds, right? 2 seconds. So what it will become? We will not get these movies data, because this movies get movies data function is dependent on this get movies, right? So if it, this function is taking 2 seconds, then it will wait for 2 seconds. It will not wait, it will first execute the next one. It will keep it as pending, as running in the background. It will run in a asynchronous behavior, and it will run the next one. And because we don't have movies yet, because it is taking the time, right? So what we can do, we want that first we want to get the movies from this function, and after this function completes, only after this function completion we want to run this function. So what is the way to do that? What we can do is, let's implement our API function in such a way so that it will first run this run this get movies function, right? So first it will run get movies, and after that it should run get movies data function. So what we can do here, we will alter this function, API function, and here we will pass a callback, right? So now I'm saying this function will take superheroes parameter and callback, right? So here I'm saying it will take a callback as well, and once it get the movies, it should return the callback with movies, correct? Now it is saying callback is not a function, no matter. So now here let's see what you can run, how you can run this function. Now we will get the movies data directly. I'm saying get movies superheroes, and after this I need to pass a callback function. So what I will do, I will pass a callback, and as an argument I'm passing movies, and I will say just run the get movies data in this callback function, movies, and return this, right? Now if I do console log movies data, you can see we are getting the same result, right? So now we are sure that after this code, only after completion of this code, after getting movies, it will run this callback function, right? Correct. Now let's see another scenario. Let's say it is taking some time, but what is wrong with this code? So this function currently it is in our code, but let's say it is not in our code, right? In the real scenarios it will be some API function. How you are ensure that on the API designer or some backend developer is corrected this code like this, like it will call this callback function after doing all the logic of this function. You are not sure, right? And so in this scenario, sorry, in this approach, you are basically dependent on the API function, right? But that is not a good practice, right? So you should write your code in such a way so that you are not dependent on any API function, but you are dependent on only your code, right? So what you can do here, promises comes. So promise you can use instead of calling this callback. So what we will do, let's implement this function again. Let me comment it down, and now again what I will do, I will write a function. I will comment all these. Now here I'm saying get movies is equal to, it will take only one array of superheroes, right? Now what it will do, it will do the same logic, right? So this logic, let me uncomment it. Now this function get movies will return a promise. Instead of running or returning a simple array, we want to return a promise here. So what we can do, let's write return new promise, and promise takes callback, resolve and reject, right? Now in this callback, add your logic for getting movies. After adding this logic, let's say if movies dot length is not equal to 0, resolve the promise with movies, right? Else reject the promise, right? So now if I want to call this function, this promise function, how I can call? Here, instead of doing this, I will do const promise is equal to get movies, and I will pass superheroes array, right? So now see here, we are not, this function is not returning any value now. Now this is returning a promise object. So what is a promise object? It's nothing. It's just like, you can assume it's just like a empty object. Let's say this empty object is returning some data to us, and this data can be undefined, right? Because this promise will take some time to resolve. This is an API function, right? And this will take some time to give us the correct response. And till this will return us the correct response, this promise object will be undefined. And after, let's say after 2 seconds, this we got the response, and now it will fill this promise up. Let's say it will add the data here instead of undefined, right? So we are getting an surety that this promise will be fulfilled whenever this logic is completed, right? So now here, how we can ensure that after this promise is resolved, only after that we want to run this function get movies data. What we can do? Now here you can see the promise change. So we will do like this, promise dot then, and after then we will attach a callback function here, and I will say movies, and here I will console log get movies data with movies. Now here you can see we are getting our response as same, right? But what is the benefit of not using callbacks instead of using these promises? Nothing is changed, right? So see here we are basically attaching a callback function to a promise, right? But we are not passing a callback function to this API function now, right? So this API function is only taking this superheroes array, right? But we are not dependent on this API function now. So API function will not execute our callback function, but here we will execute our callback function by attaching it to this promise, right? So now here we are using a sample code. Now let's see how you can work with real scenarios. So we will take an API, a GitHub API, a simple GitHub API, and using that API we will see how you can use your promises, right? So let me add a code here. So you can see this is a GitHub API URL. You can use any example API, any public API for this. And now let's say this is an API which returns repos for one user, right? For a GitHub user. So I am adding my user ID, my GitHub user ID here, and I want all the repos I have in my GitHub, right? So now what I will say, I will use fetch to call this API and I will get the response, right? So what I will do, I want repos, and this repos from where I can get from GitHub, right? So here you can see I'm calling this API, GitHub API, using fetch, but this API will take some time to give me the correct response, right? So now if I use console.log repos, so you will see it is saying promise is pending. That means it is taking some time. It has not fulfilled yet, right? This promise is not resolved yet. It is pending. So what I can do, I will do like this, repos dot then, I will attach a callback here so that when promise is resolved, after this run this function, this callback function which I am passing to this. So I will say repos.then and I will say data or something, data, and console log the data, right? Now you can see we are getting a response here, right? So how we are getting response? We are saying whenever this promise is resolved, after resolving of promise, I want to run this callback function, and this callback function is running after the promise is resolved, right? So now it is not giving us the correct data, it is giving us the API response. So now if I want the data, so what I can do, I will return here data.json, right? I will convert it to JSON. Now how I can access it? I will not console log it here. I will add a new chain. So this is work like a chain. So that's why it called like a promise chain. So I will add a new then here, and here I will say data. Now here in this, what data I am getting? This data I am returning as JSON here. So I will say here data, this is a callback function, and in this callback function I want to console log the data. And this you can see I'm getting my data, my complete repos array here, right? So now here I'm getting the response. So now let's see how you can convert this code. This is a code for where we are using promise chains, but instead how we can use async await without doing these kind of stuff like we are using here the promise chains. So here if you want to do something with your data, so you can only do inside this scope, this promise scope. You cannot access this data outside of this promise, right? So now if you want to run a function, you want to call it in a function, so how you can do that? You will use async functions for doing that. So let's do the same. Let me comment it down, and now let's create a new async function, and I will name it, let's say, get API data. Okay, and I will say this is an async function, and this will take a URL of API, and here what we'll do, basically it will get the data, right? First it will get the response from where? From fetch, right? Fetch URL, every URL which we pass from this function, and it will fetch this URL and it will get a response. But here, as you know, it will take some time, and this is a promise, and this promise will be pending. So we want our response to filled into this variable once this promise is resolved. So how I can do that? How it will wait for this? We will add a wait here. So if I'm adding a wait, so it is ensuring, instead of adding this dot then here, dot then data, I am saying await for this, like wait for this promise to resolve, and after this resolving this promise, get the response and store that into this variable, right? So now it got the response. Now what we can do, we want to convert it into JSON. So we will say data is equal to await response dot JSON, right? Now we are getting the data. Now you can console log it, right? So now how you can run this function? You just need to call this function. Just call this function get API data and pass it GitHub API URL. Now you can see we are getting the complete data response as expected, right? So this is how you can use async await functions. So now let's say you want to return this data, not console log, you want to return this data from this function. So you can, if you do return data and you want to console.log, let's say const API data is equal to, and you want to console log app API data. So you will see here it is saying promise pending. Why? So whenever you return something from an async function, it will not return any value. It will only return a promise. So this thing you need to remember, whenever you want to return something from a async function, so it will return a promise instead of any value. So when you are getting a promise returned from a function, why it is returning a promise? Because it will take some time, right? This function will take some time to resolve this, all the things it has, right? So for executing this data, for getting this data, what you can do, you will create either another async function to use this, to resolve this promise, you have to wait until this promise will be resolved, right? Or you can directly run your promise chains, right? How you can run, you can just do API data dot then, and you will say data and console log the data, right? So you will see here you are getting the data, right? So this is the simple thing. This is the explanation of promises, how you can use promises. So promises are better way to fetch your APIs, and whenever you work with APIs, you need to work with promises. And for promises, instead of using this dot then every time, you can use async and await function. So this is very helpful for you for working with APIs whenever you are working with APIs in JavaScript. So thanks for tuning into my channel. I hope you found the content valuable. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video.